The most lethal force on Earth is not gravity or fire. It is the fear of looking weak in front of a crowd. Today, we reconstruct the final moments of 6 men who saw death coming but refused to step aside because people were watching. From a rocket car to a 500-ton train, these are not accidents. They are sacrifices to the ego. Do not follow their path. Watch, learn, and survive. The date was October 5th, 1979. The place was Morrisburg, Ontario, a small town on the Canadian bank of the St. Lawrence River, now the center of a media circus. A crowd of thousands huddled under a cold gray sky, their breath misting in the autumn air. They were all there to see one man, Ken Carter, the stuntman known across the nation as the Mad Canadian. For 5 excruciating years, Carter had poured every dollar he had, over $500,000 in total, into a single, magnificent, and deeply flawed dream. He was going to fly a car across the 1-mile-wide river. His vehicle, the Lincoln Rocket, sat gleaming on its launch pad. It was a monstrous hybrid, the body of a luxury Lincoln Continental fused with a massive rocket engine capable of producing 10,000 pounds of thrust. The launch ramp itself was an immense structure, a steel tongue pointed defiantly at the sky, designed to accelerate the car to a theoretical takeoff speed of nearly 300 miles per hour. To the cheering crowd, it was a symbol of human audacity. But for Ken Carter, it was a monument to a lie he could no longer escape. The system he presented as a triumph of backyard engineering was, in fact, a proven failure. He knew this with absolute certainty. A year prior, during a televised test run, the entire project had collapsed into a humiliating fiasco. The car didn't fly. It lumbered off the ramp with all the grace of a falling brick, crashing clumsily and exposing its catastrophic aerodynamic instability. The heavy, blocky shape of a luxury sedan was simply not designed to function as a wing. At high speeds, it generated unpredictable forces that made a stable flight impossible. His team had made repairs, but they were cosmetic, superficial fixes to a fundamental problem. The chassis was suffering from metal fatigue. The welds, strained by the rocket's vibrations, were dangerously weak. His own engineers had voiced their grave concerns, but their warnings were drowned out by the roar of Carter's ambition. Now, standing before the live television cameras and the thousands of expectant faces, the technical reality of his situation was eclipsed by a far more powerful force: the weight of his own legend. He had built an identity around being the man who never backed down. To cancel the stunt now would mean admitting failure, facing financial ruin, and killing the Mad Canadian persona forever. He was trapped between 2 choices, each a different kind of death. One was a swift physical end. The other was a slow, public execution of his character. He chose to protect the legend. With a stoic expression for the cameras, he climbed into the cockpit, strapping himself into a machine he knew was a death trap. The countdown began, each number a hammer blow against his chance to turn back. 10, 9, 8. Inside the cramped cabin, the world was a muffled roar of the crowd and the low hum of the rocket's fuel pumps. This was the critical juncture, the last moment where a word, a signal, could have saved him. But admitting fear was a price his pride refused to pay. 3, 2, 1, ignition. A violent, deafening explosion of sound and fire erupted from the engine. The entire structure shuddered as the car was unleashed. It shot down the ramp like a bullet, a white streak against the gray landscape. For a few brief, breathtaking seconds, the illusion held. It was accelerating perfectly. It looked like it was going to work. The car cleared the end of the ramp. It was airborne. For a fraction of a second, it was flying. Then, the laws of physics rendered their verdict. The car's inherent instability took immediate control. The nose pitched down violently, not into a glide, but a dive. The immense force of the air hitting the unaerodynamic body at over 250 miles per hour converged on the vehicle's weakened frame. A sharp cracking sound, like a rifle shot, was heard over the rocket's roar as the first structural weld failed. It was followed by the sickening groan of twisting steel. The machine experienced a catastrophic structural failure. It didn't explode. It was brutally torn apart in mid-air. The entire frame buckled and ripped in two. The rocket engine tore free from its mountings, continuing its trajectory alone like a rogue missile. The cockpit, containing Carter, became a separate, tumbling projectile, spinning helplessly as it plunged toward the river. The impact with the water was absolute, causing immediate and fatal trauma. The thunderous roar was replaced by a sudden, profound silence, broken only by a collective gasp from the crowd. All that remained was a splash, a plume of white water, and the scattered, unrecognizable debris of a Lincoln Continental gently bobbing on the cold surface of the St. Lawrence. The massive, empty ramp stood as a silent, stark monument to an ego that would rather break against reality than ever admit it was wrong. The date was March 5, 1977. The place was the Kyalami Grand Prix circuit in South Africa, a ribbon of black asphalt shimmering under a brutal, baking sun. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the smell of hot rubber and high-octane fuel. But the defining sensation was the sound, a relentless, deafening scream of Formula One engines that hammered at your chest. This was one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, a place where men and machines operated at the absolute limit. Positioned around this cauldron of speed were the track marshals, the volunteer army responsible for safety. Among them, holding a heavy 40-pound fire extinguisher, stood Frederick Janssen van Vuren. He was only 19 years old, a young man surrounded by seasoned veterans who moved with a quiet confidence that he desperately craved. He watched them, studying their calm efficiency, and felt a burning need to prove he wasn't just a kid. He wanted to belong. He wanted their respect. To get it, he believed he had to be fast, decisive, and heroic. The single most important rule drilled into every marshal was simple and non-negotiable. You do not, under any circumstances, cross a live racetrack. The track is a forbidden zone. You wait for orders. You wait for a signal. You wait for the cars to pass. This rule was the system designed to keep them alive. On the 22nd lap of the race, Van Vuren saw his chance. The car of driver Renzo Zorzi pulled over on the main straight, directly across from his post. A small fuel fire had started in the engine bay, sending a thin trail of smoke into the air. The situation was not critical. Zorzi was already climbing out of the car, completely unharmed. The fire was minor. But in Van Vuren's mind, this small plume of smoke was a signal flare, a personal call to action. His supervising marshal saw the same scene and gave a clear order. "Wait!" Another, more experienced marshal on Van Vuren's side of the track was already responding correctly, running along the grass verge toward the car. But Van Vuren didn't hear the order, or if he did, he ignored it. His judgment was clouded by a powerful internal pressure. The fear of being seen as slow, the fear of looking hesitant or useless in front of the veterans, became a more immediate threat than the screaming race cars. He made a decision based not on protocol, but on pride. Believing he could sprint across the track in a gap between cars, he broke the primary rule. This was his fatal choice. Hoisting the heavy extinguisher, he bolted onto the asphalt. At that exact instant, two cars crested a blind hill at the top of the straight at full speed. The drivers were Hans-Joachim Stuck and Tom Price. From their low-slung cockpits, moving at over 250 feet per second, the track had been cleared just a moment before. Now, impossibly, a human figure was directly in their path. Stuck, the lead driver, reacted with incredible reflexes, swerving his car violently and missing Van Vuren by a matter of inches. But Tom Price, following directly in Stuck's slipstream, was completely blind. His view was blocked by the car in front of him. By the time Stuck swerved, Price had zero time to react. The impact was a simple, brutal equation of physics. The Shadow DN8 race car, weighing over 300 pounds and traveling at 170 miles per hour, struck the young marshal. The outcome was instantaneous and non-survivable. The heavy fire extinguisher was ripped from Van Vuren's hands and flew through the air, striking Tom Price in the head with the same deadly velocity, causing a fatal cranial injury. Price's car, its driver no longer in control, continued down the straight at full throttle, a ghost machine that eventually crashed out of the race. In the immediate chaos, the full tragedy wasn't understood. The impact had left Van Vuren's body so catastrophically damaged that visual identification was impossible. The grim truth was only confirmed later, when race officials conducted a roll call of all the marshals. They called out every name, and one by one, each man answered. When they were all accounted for except one, they finally knew who it was. Frederick Jansen Van Vuren had desperately wanted to prove himself, but his impulsive act, born from a fear of looking weak, had led to a tragedy that cost 2 lives. October 12, 2002. The location was the Shawangunk Ridge in upstate New York, a world-famous climbing destination known simply as the Gunks. The rock here is hard, white quartz conglomerate, vertical and unforgiving. The morning air was biting cold, and the cliffs were still damp from a heavy rainstorm the night before. This moisture made the rock treacherous, turning the microscopic edges that climbers rely on into slick, unusable surfaces. Into this dangerous environment stepped Stephen Gastein. He was a veteran of the sport, a man who had spent 30 years mastering the art of moving over stone. To the group of young, aspiring climbers he was leading that day, Gastein was more than just an instructor. He was a living legend, a guru who preached that climbing was a spiritual act of control. He taught them that safety gear was necessary for them, but for a true master, the mind was the only anchor required. He had built his entire identity around this aura of invincibility, a carefully cultivated image of a man who was immune to fear and gravity. They reached a section of the climb known as a traverse, a horizontal path across a sheer, vertical face with a 300-foot drop below. The standard safety protocol for this section is non-negotiable. A lead climber must place active protection, spring-loaded camming devices or metal nuts jammed into cracks, and clip the rope to them. This ensures that if a slip occurs, the fall is limited to a few feet. One of the students following the training stepped forward to hand Gastein a rack of protective gear. It was a routine gesture, the logical action of a rational human being preparing to enter a death zone. But Gastein looked at the gear with a dismissive, almost arrogant smile. He shook his head. He announced to the group that he would climb this section free solo, without a rope, without protection, without a net. He wanted to demonstrate what he called absolute commitment. In reality, he was driven by a toxic mix of ego and insecurity. He was aging, and he felt the desperate need to prove to these younger men that he was still the alpha, still the untouchable master of the rock. He stepped out onto the face. The students watched in terrified silence, their cameras recording the moment. For the first 20 feet, Gastein moved with his trademark grace, his hands and feet finding purchase on the cold stone. He looked perfect. He looked like the legend he claimed to be. But the rock does not care about reputation. As he shifted his weight onto a small, sloping foothold, the laws of physics asserted themselves. The rubber of his climbing shoe, compromised by the damp lichen on the surface, failed to generate the necessary friction. There was no warning, no sound. His foot simply skated off the rock. It was a minor error, the kind that happens to every climber on every trip. Usually the rope catches you, you curse, and you try again. But Gastein had removed the rope. In that horrific split second, as gravity grabbed him, he had one final chance to survive. A large, solid jug, a handhold, was within reach of his right hand. A desperate, frantic lunge would have allowed him to catch it. He could have scrambled, clawed, and fought his way back to balance. But to scramble is to look like a beginner. To lunge is to show panic. To fight for survival is to admit that you are afraid. In the warped logic of his ego, flailing in front of his students was a fate worse than death. It would have shattered the mask of the Zen master he had worn for decades. So Stephen Gastein made the most chilling decision of his life. He did not lunge. He did not scream. He did not scramble. As his balance crossed the point of no return, he simply accepted the fall. He kept his body composed, his face calm, maintaining the illusion of control, even as he plummeted backward into the void. He chose to die looking like a master rather than live looking like a human. The fall lasted less than 4 seconds. The impact at the base of the cliff was catastrophic and instantly fatal. The group of students was left standing on the ledge, frozen in a trauma that would last a lifetime. Next to their feet lay the coil of high-strength nylon rope, a perfectly functional piece of engineering that could have saved a life, had that life not been weighed down by the heavy, fatal burden of pride. August 5, 1951. The Niagara River was a churning monster of green water and white foam, rushing toward the precipice of the Horseshoe Falls. On the banks, a staggering crowd of nearly 200,000 people had gathered. They packed the railings, the parks, and the rooftops. A massive sea of faces, all turned toward the water. They were waiting for a show. They were waiting for William Red Hill Jr. At 38 years old, Hill was a man drowning on dry land. His last name was legendary in Niagara. His father, the original Red Hill, was a riverman of almost mythical status, a hero who had pulled 28 living souls and 177 bodies from these deadly rapids. But the son had inherited only the name, not the luck. He was broke, struggling to support his family, and suffocating under the expectation that he would repeat his father's feats. The only currency that mattered in his world was the fame that came from conquering the falls. But unlike the daredevils before him, who used steel barrels reinforced with oak and iron, Hill had no money for engineering. He had built a vessel out of desperation. He called it the Thing. It was a pathetic makeshift contraption constructed from 13 heavy-duty truck inner tubes, tied together with fish netting and encased in canvas straps. It looked less like a boat and more like a pile of floating junk. There was no steel frame to absorb the shock of the 167-foot drop. There was no rigid shell to protect his body from the millions of tons of crashing water. It was, quite literally, a soft rubber balloon going into a hydraulic press. Every river expert knew it was a doomed vessel. Hill knew it too. In the final hour before the launch, the facade of the brave hero completely collapsed. Alone in a small shack near the launch site, away from the cheering crowds, Hill broke down. He wept openly, his body shaking with terror. He turned to his assistants and confessed, "I don't think I'm coming out of this." He was staring directly at his own death. This was his chance to walk away. He could have stepped out, announced the stunt was off, and gone home to his wife and children. But outside, the crowd was chanting his name. The reporters were ready with their pens. The cameras were rolling. In that moment, Hill realized that his fear of being called a coward, of shaming his father's name, was stronger than his fear of dying. He wiped his tears, put on a fake smile, and walked to the river. He climbed into the center of the tubes, sealing himself into a soft, dark coffin. The vessel was towed out. At 1:30 p.m., the line was cut. The Thing drifted toward the brink, looking small and fragile against the vast power of the river. As it tipped over the edge, the silence of the crowd was deafening. The vessel fell 167 feet, accelerating to 60 miles per hour. It hit the turbulent water at the base of the falls with the force of a car crash. The physics of the impact were brutal and immediate. The water didn't cushion the fall. It shattered the vessel. The canvas straps snapped like thread. The fish netting tore apart. The inner tubes were ripped away from each other by the violent, churning currents. The Thing simply disintegrated upon impact. Hill was ejected instantly, his unprotected body thrown into the devil's washing machine, a chaotic vortex of rocks and water. He suffered massive blunt force trauma and drowned within seconds. The crowd waited for the vessel to resurface. 1 minute passed, then 2. Then, pieces of rubber tubing began to pop up in the foam, then a shoe. The realization swept through the crowd like a cold wind. The river had taken him. His battered body was found the next day, washed up on the rocks. William Hill didn't die because of a mistake. He died because he was too afraid to live as the man who walked away. His death was so senseless, so obviously driven by social pressure, that it forced the government to act. The Niagara Parks Act was passed shortly after, making stunting illegal and closing the era of the barrel riders forever. November 14th, 1958. The city was Chicago, a sprawling grid of ambition carved from steel and stone, shivering under the approach of a brutal gray winter. The location was the skeleton of a rising skyscraper in the heart of the Loop, a rusty red cage of iron climbing 50 stories into the overcast sky. At this altitude, the environment is alien to human life. The air is thinner, colder, and moves with a violence unknown to the pedestrians walking on the sidewalks 500 feet below. This was the domain of the connectors, the elite ironworkers who walked the narrow beams, bolting the city together. Among this crew were 2 men, Jack Miller and his foreman, Tom Kowalski. They were veterans of the high steel, men who had spent years conditioning their brains to ignore the screaming alarm of vertigo. They didn't just work at height, they lived there. They walked on 6-inch wide flanges of steel with their hands in their pockets, a display of casual arrogance that was part of the job description. But on this freezing Tuesday, the routine boredom of the lunch hour mutated into a deadly game. It started with a simple jagged insult about balance, a challenge to the other's nerve. In the hyper-masculine culture of the job site, ignoring a challenge was a sign of weakness. It was a corrosion of respect. So, a bet was made. It wasn't for money. It was for the title of the King of the Beam. The terms were simple and insane. Walk out to the end of a cantilevered I-beam, 50 stories above the street, and stand there. No safety tethers, no holding onto the vertical columns. Just 2 men standing side by side on a strip of steel the width of a boot, waiting to see who would crouch or grab a support first. They walked out. The wind was gusting at 30 miles per hour, creating a low, mournful howl as it cut through the open lattice of the building. They reached the end of the beam and turned to face the wind, like 2 duelists facing a firing squad. For the first minute, it was a display of supreme physical control. Their bodies made micro-adjustments, their vestibular systems fighting the chaotic motion of the air. They looked like statues against the gray sky. But at 50 stories, the wind is not a constant flow. It is a turbulent, fluid force. The building's structure created invisible swirls of air that can hit with the force of a physical blow. Kowalski, the older and heavier man, relied on his mass to anchor him. Miller, wiry and tense, relied on his reflexes. They stood there, locking eyes, neither willing to be the first to show the trembling of fear. The logic of survival demanded that they sit down, crawl back, and live. The logic of the duel demanded they stand and die. Then, the atmosphere shifted. A sudden, rogue gust, compressed by the neighboring buildings, slammed into the south face of the structure. It hit them with a pressure of 20 pounds per square foot. It was the moment of truth. Miller, sensing the shift, broke the rules. His survival instinct finally overrode his pride. He dropped his center of gravity, bending his knees and reaching out to grab the flange of the beam. He looked weak, shuddering as he clung to the metal. But he was secure. Kowalski did not bend. To crouch was to lose. To grab the beam was to admit that he was afraid of the wind. He tried to fight the invisible hand of the gale with rigid muscle and stubborn will. He locked his knees, making his body a stiff, unyielding sail. This was a fatal physiological error. A rigid structure cannot absorb shock, it tips. The gust pushed his center of mass just inches past the point of recoverability. There was no flailing, no cinematic scream. One moment, he was the king of the steel. The next, gravity simply claimed what was hers. His boot slipped from the wet, cold iron. Because he was standing so straight, he didn't fall forward or backward. He was swept sideways, off the beam, and into the empty air. The physics of the fall were mathematical and absolute. Accelerating at 32 feet per second squared, he fell for nearly 10 seconds before impact. Miller, crouching on the beam, watched his foreman disappear into the urban canyon below. The silence that followed was heavier than the steel they built with. The wind continued to howl, indifferent to the fact that it had just won the bet. Kowalski's death was not an accident of the job. It was a sacrifice on the altar of a pride that refused to bend, proving that while a man can build a skyscraper to the heavens, he can never build a platform high enough to escape the laws of physics. The date was July 14, 1995. The setting was a rusted steel trestle bridge spanning a deep, rocky gorge in rural Washington state. It was a relic of the industrial age, suspended 100 feet above a dry riverbed, baking under the relentless summer sun. To the local teenagers, this bridge was more than just infrastructure. It was a proving ground, a narrow stage where boys tried to become legends. On this sweltering afternoon, the air smelled of hot creosote and ozone. A group of 4 friends stood in the center of the span, surrounded by the dizzying heat radiating from the iron rails. Among them was 19-year-old Michael, the charismatic leader of the group, a young man whose sense of invincibility was his defining trait. They were there to play a game known locally as the chicken. The rules were terrifyingly simple. Stand on the tracks as a freight train approached and see who could hold their ground the longest before jumping into the small safety bays built into the side of the bridge. It was a test of nerve, a battle to suppress the biological imperative to flee. At 3:45 p.m., the distinct, low-frequency rumble of a Burlington Northern freight train began to vibrate through the steel skeleton of the bridge. The train was a behemoth, 3 locomotives pulling 100 loaded coal cars, a moving mass of nearly 12,000 tons, traveling at 55 miles per hour. As the train rounded the bend half a mile away, its single headlight piercing the heat haze, the game began. The boys stood their ground, shoulders touching, locking eyes with the approaching machine. The noise grew from a rumble to a deafening roar that shook their chests. At 400 yards, the first 2 friends broke. They scrambled into the safety bays, pressing their backs against the rusted steel, screaming for the others to follow. At 200 yards, the third boy dove for safety. Only Michael remained. He stood directly between the rails, staring down the approaching locomotive. In his mind, he was calculating time. He believed he had control. He believed he could wait until the train was 50 yards away and then casually step aside, cementing his status as the bravest of them all. This calculation was his fatal error, born from a deadly optical illusion known as the looming effect. When a large object approaches directly head-on, the human brain struggles to accurately estimate its speed. To Michael, the train appeared to be floating toward him slowly, a massive but sluggish object. In reality, it was closing the distance at 80 feet per second. The engineer slammed on the emergency brakes, locking the wheels and sending a shower of sparks flying. But physics is indifferent to intent. A train of that mass requires over a mile to stop. At this distance, it was effectively a meteor sliding on friction. Michael held his pose. He waited. He waited too long. When the train was just 60 feet away, less than 1 second of travel time, he finally decided to move. He turned to step into the safety niche, a movement that takes a human being roughly 1.5 seconds to execute. He simply ran out of time, but his second error was even more catastrophic. He assumed that stepping off the rail meant he was safe. He forgot the impact zone. A locomotive is significantly wider than the track it runs on. extending 3 feet past the rail on either side to accommodate the engine's mechanics. As Michael stepped off the wooden tie, he thought he was clear. He was wrong. He was still deep within the train's path. He didn't even have time to scream. The train did not hit him. It obliterated the space he occupied. The front corner of the locomotive, a wall of solid steel, struck him with a force that defies biological description. The impact was not a collision, it was an erasure. The sheer displacement of air alone, the bow wave, hit him with the force of a hurricane an instant before the metal did. His body was instantly compromised by massive blunt force trauma and thrown from the bridge like a rag doll, falling 100 feet into the gorge below. The train shrieked and sparked for another 5,000 feet before finally grinding to a halt, the silence that followed amplifying the horror of the event. Michael had technically won the bet. He was the last one on the tracks. But in the cold calculus of the physical world, courage without math is just a complicated form of self-destruction. He died not because he was slow, but because he believed that his ego could negotiate with 12,000 tons of steel. We write brave on their tombstones, but I see men who were too terrified to say no. Is a man who walks into a death trap just to impress strangers a hero? Or is he actually the ultimate coward? Tell me below. Is backing down a sign of weakness, or is it the only sign of intelligence? Most of you are too afraid to answer this honestly. Like and subscribe now.